we're seeing higher intensity events more often. We're likelier seeing more severe weather as we move into the future.
We're actually starting to see some of the increased incidents of high-end storm events like the derecho that went through Iowa and caused so much agricultural damage.
When we start seeing these bigger surges of rain, we know this stuff is changing. I don't care what you call it, I'm going to adapt to it, and that's how we're going to keep farming.
There's a high likelihood that our flooding events are going to become more intense and more often.
2008 made it through the flood, 2016 came back again. The derecho, we can't afford to lose everything again.
And not have this happen again and expect a similar type of recovery.
Iowa's wild weather is becoming more extreme. Floods, drought, derechos, tornadoes.
What should be once-in-a-lifetime events are happening more frequently.
And these billion-dollar disasters are costing you more than just money.
In our half-hour special tonight, the Iowa's News Now WeatherFirst team tracks how you're coping with the extreme weather and what's being done to protect your community.
In order to understand these extreme weather systems, we wanted to look into why the weather is changing, how we know it's changing, and how we know it's getting worse. But first, we have to talk about the C word, Nathan.
Yeah, well, we do. I spoke with an atmospheric scientist and expert in climate modeling to better understand what scientists mean when we say that the climate is changing.
The sun, which we know and love, it emits energy. That light falls on the planet, heats up the surface of the Earth. The surface of the Earth then emits light in what we call infrared spectrum, which you can kind of feel but not see. As we emit more of these greenhouse gases and as we get more CO2 and methane in the atmosphere, that balance is tipped a little bit, and more of that infrared radiation is being reflected back down to the planet and heating it up. There is this observatory on a mountain peak in Hawaii, the Mauna Loa Climate Observatory, where some of the cleanest air on the planet is. And so this is what we call the Keeling curve. It's that curve of the parts per million of CO2 molecules per other molecules of air. And the problem with anthropogenic climate change is the rate at which it happens. It's happening in decadal rather than centuries or millennia. We're actually seeing some of the earlier simulations that we made of the climate being verified. We're actually starting to see some of the increased incidents of high-end storm events like the derecho that went through Iowa and caused so much agricultural damage actually coming into being.
The derecho is just one example of those very extreme wild weather events that have occurred in the last several decades in eastern Iowa. I speak with the state climatologist about how these extreme events are linked to climate change.
2008 made it through the flood.
Barb Hartgrave owns County Line Catering and Barbecue.
2016 came back again.
She's been running restaurants in Cedar Rapids for nearly 20 years.
We've just been trying to keep going with it, and then the derecho.
During that time, she's been impacted by multiple historical weather events.
We have to be cautious in terms of looking at individual events and saying, oh, this is climate change induced. If we start to see behavior moving forward in terms of tornadic behavior, for example, then we can start to say that yes, the fingerprints of climate change are on tornado outbreaks.
What Barb has been through can be explained by climate change. Temperatures have been increasing across the globe.
Now you look at the last 30 years, we've actually doubled that temperature increase per decade.
And that affects weather over time.
Warmer atmospheres hold more water vapor, and that has implications on severe weather, flooding.
In 2008, the first disaster struck Cedar Rapids and 3 of Barb's restaurants.
I think it all happened in that same day, but the water filled the basement, which was 12 feet, and then it filled our restaurants with about 5.5 feet of water. So anything that was in there was not salvageable.
During that time, not many people near the Cedar River had flood insurance because the river had never gone over 20 feet in the 157 years on record. That day, the river rose over 31 feet.
We're seeing more 50, 100-year floods that we haven't seen going back several decades.
Barb was able to get enough money to reopen one restaurant downtown, and then 8 years later, the Cedar threatened again.
We were forced to shut down for 2 weeks, move all of our stuff to higher ground.
The river didn't rise as high as expected, but still got over that 20-foot threshold for only the second time ever.
So there's a high likelihood that our flooding events are going to become more intense and more often as we move through the 21st century.
Unfortunately, because Barb didn't have damage in 2016, she once again did not have insurance coverage. She decided to keep going, though, and opened up her catering business away from the river.
I'm not a quitter. I won't quit. And I hate failure.
In addition to catering, Barb serves people out of her barbecue barn. She was doing just that on August 10th, 2020. She was packing up as she watched the dark clouds ahead of the derecho roll in when winds trapped her and her manager inside.
And we got underneath the table, and it wasn't 2 minutes after that, and the whole thing went over. Finally, after 45 minutes, it started clearing up enough, and I heard my son's truck coming up, and I heard him screaming, "I don't want to look, I don't want to look." Sorry.
No, it's terrifying.
It was.
99.9th percentile event. I don't think we should see one of those in the next, that's a generational storm, hopefully. But if we look at the climatology of derechos, we experience one in Iowa every 2 years. Now we've had 2 in 2 years. The first December derecho in United States history, let alone the largest tornado outbreak for the state of Iowa, and we can expect those extremes moving forward.
State climatologist Justin Glisson briefly mentioned that unprecedented tornado outbreak, and that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, we have seen some significant changes in our tornado numbers in just the last few years. In Iowa alone, since 1950, 8 of the top 10 largest tornado outbreaks on record have occurred since the year 2000. 2 of the top 4 tornado outbreaks happened just last year. We are seeing more tornadoes, but the timing is becoming more unusual as well. May and June historically are the most active tornado months in Iowa. However, the top tornado outbreaks in Iowa history are now shifting to more unusual months. The top 2 are in December and August. The overall trend is larger tornado outbreaks overall.
Now, since the 1950s, if we look at days in which we have at least one tornado forming, we're actually seeing that trend go down. Where the trend is increasing are days in which we see 30 tornadoes or more.
The tornado season in 2022 already off to a fast start, including the deadly EF4 tornado affecting Winterset. That tornado tracked more than 70 miles, the 7th longest track in state history.
March 17th, 2019.
You can prepare for anything that you think might be coming, but Mother Nature always wins.
The Missouri River crested to a record-breaking 40.62 feet, sending floodwaters into the small southwest Iowa town of Pacific Junction. And the town is no stranger to flooding. 3 out of the top 5 historic crests along the Missouri River happened within the last 12 years.
The landscape has changed tremendous.
3 years later, the town has been washed off the map. The population has gone from 475 to 98.
Some of us have been here, close to 60 years. So I think it all depends on how deep your roots were.
Mayor Andy Young says he's never once thought about leaving Pacific Junction. He's been here over 60 years. He spends his days helping residents repair their homes.
Well, 3 years from today, I hope that we have enough structure and people to survive.
Heavy rainfall events are becoming increasingly common in Iowa as the climate warms, and farmers have to deal with it. In this special report, I take you to a Fayette County farm that is working on techniques that could help prevent floods downstream.
Part of adapting to what Mother Nature's throwing at us.
No profession is as reliant on the weather as farming. And some are taking action to develop new ways to deal with the increasing heavy rainfall.
But when we start seeing these bigger surges of rain and stuff like that, we know this stuff is changing. I don't care what you call it, I'm going to adapt to it, and that's how we're going to keep farming.
What you're seeing here is the normal platiness a soybean field would have, but now with the roots and the earthworms in there, you can tell how we're starting to rebuild all that.
In an effort to combat the increasing intensity of rain events, Steinlage's farm in Fayette County is experimenting with new ways of planting, using multiple crops through the year with overlapping growing seasons and multiple harvest times. This helps build root structure in the soil, preventing erosion of the valuable topsoil. This method also helps retain more water, preventing it from going downstream.
I'm right on the west side of town. This creek right down here flows through town. So if there's a problem here, I know I'm going to hear about it there.
With this relay cropping method, following harvest, a cereal crop like rye, barley, or oats is planted. This crop will grow very early in the spring, and they're planted in rows with space in between. Then during the normal spring plant, a crop like soybeans can be planted in between. There are many benefits of having this early season cereal crop already growing. The soil is stabilized, heavy rainfall is better absorbed to prevent muddy field conditions, which could keep equipment from planting, and the early season plant growth helps suppress weeds.
The litter layer here is what's breaking the rainfall's drop, keeping the soil erosion under minimum.
And of course, there's a financial benefit to it all as well.
Now with the relay cropping, we can actually turn the cash flow that it'd probably take 250 bushel corn to get me excited about growing corn again.
This also has a benefit to those downstream of you, because when it comes to these excessive rain events, you're actually able to absorb more water during these high-end seasons, correct?
Yes, and I mean, we started noticing that 9 years ago, I think it was, we figured out that, you know, our tile lines just don't run near as much, and when you start seeing some of that stuff, you start asking yourself, okay, what's different here than what's across the fence difference?
The frequency of reaching major flood stage along the Turkey River at Garber, downstream of Steinlage's farm, is increasing rapidly. During the 2010s, the river hit major flood stage 7 times, more than double any previous decade since record keeping began in 1900, and with a rapid upward trend since the 1970s.
The largest tool that we have to combat that in our state is the soil.
Russ Evelsizer at the Northeast Iowa Resource Conservation and Development works with Steinlage to improve data sharing and to improve techniques.
It's way easier to stop a flood if you're catching the raindrop, so to speak, where it falls, versus at the bottom of the hill with very expensive man-made infrastructure.
And you're talking about being able to handle these significant heavy rain events, which are increasing by being able to absorb some of that water, but also has a benefit on the other end of the spectrum in those drought years.
I think what a lot of producers are starting to look at is how to emulate their cropping systems more based on natural systems, where if it's a drought year, that's okay. And if it's a flood year, that's okay too.
For Steinlage, his goal is to educate and encourage other farmers to pick up this practice. He knows it's a slow process, but he's already seeing relay cropping pick up around his county, and he does not want to keep this practice to himself.
How do we help other guys learn this stuff without offending people? We've got to collect the data, share the data, and help teach other guys how to do this.
It's been 2 years since the Cedar River reached flood stage in Cedar Rapids, but experts say flooding events are becoming more extreme and frequent. The city of Cedar Rapids is continuing work on the $750 million flood mitigation projects, knowing the next flood is just around the corner.
Cedar Rapids.
As we know, we're no stranger to those natural disasters in Iowa.
A city full of people that know flooding all too well.
Flood waters kept rising and kept rising.
The flood of all floods. 2008, a record-setting crest of 31.12 feet, 19 feet above flood stage.
Helped participate in boat rescues for about a 24-hour period, and obviously the floodwaters came up to 8 feet higher than predicted, and 11 feet higher than previous records.
In the weeks following the 2008 flood, the city got to work, but it took years to finalize an unparalleled $750 million flood mitigation project.
Communities really come back strong. We cannot have this happen again and expect a similar type of recovery.
But shortly after, in 2016, another scare for the city. The river crested at 21.97 feet, the second highest on record after 2008, once again causing damage to the heart of Cedar Rapids.
In 2008 and 2016, we exceeded records going back for how long? And not by a tenth or 2/10. One of them was 2 feet higher. The other one was 11.2 feet higher. So it can certainly happen again. And the city at this point is expecting this to happen.
Today, streets are blocked off, sidewalks are closed, all as this monster of a project is underway. Behind me is the First Avenue floodgate. It will eventually be able to slide across the road, protecting downtown from rising waters.
It's critical that we get this done sooner rather than later because we can't control Mother Nature, but what we can control is how ready we are once Mother Nature strikes.
Extreme rainfall events are happening more frequently across the Midwest. According to Climate Central, heavy rainfall events are up 42%. In the last 20 years, the Cedar River has reached flood stage 14 times.
It can happen again. I think 2016 proved that.
Flood projects on the east side of the Cedar River are set to be completed around 2026. The west side, mid-2030s. Both sides will be built to withstand 2008 water levels.
It was considered the probable maximum flood, so we don't really anticipate that it could get much worse than that.
With the plan intact, local businesses have returned downtown. Work just started on a new project right next to the river, bringing a restaurant, hotel, and apartments.
I think that's why you continue to see people making investments down here, because they're confident that their investment will be protected.
Despite the confidence in the flood protection,
And our mindset is, get 1% better every day and a continuous learning.
Fire Chief Greg Smith says the fire department training has changed.
Continue to do a lot of swift water training for our crews, boat rescue training, so just a lot of different types of training to make sure that we are ready for whatever the next disaster is.
They're prepared for the next disaster and know the next flood is always on the horizon.
This is a story we first told you about last year. Bayer has continued research on their short stature corn hybrids, which can withstand thunderstorm wind speeds of 75 miles per hour. The hybrids are 30 to 40% shorter than conventional corn, making it less likely to break in high wind events. Iowa has been the point of origin for testing, and Bayer plans to grow test sites across the state this summer, including one in Dyersville.
A lot of the work that we started from a discovery standpoint originated from our research site near Huxley, Iowa. And so we've been working on this for several years, but certainly the weather challenges that we've seen in the recent years have accelerated and focused our attention on many of these acres and for the growers in the state of Iowa.
Bayer plans to begin offering the crop in 2023 to select farmers to continue testing, and the goal is to have the crop on the market for all in 2024.
And corn, of course, getting a lot of attention lately in the media and from politicians as gas prices rise across the country. Tonight, I investigate the carbon cost of ethanol, how it compares to gasoline, and what can be done to further reduce its carbon footprint. Ethanol production has been the cornerstone of Iowa's economy for the better part of 2 decades. Its use as an additive in gasoline has been around since the 1970s, but it boomed in the early 2000s when a petroleum-based fuel additive called MTBE was banned in several states after it began leaking into the water supply.
Of course, the petroleum industry wanted to do it instantly to reduce their liability, and let's put ethanol in its place. Well, we didn't have enough ethanol, and so it actually started a boom in ethanol production.
According to the Iowa Corn Growers Association, 57% of corn grown in the state now goes towards ethanol production.
You're going to be able to keep filling up with E15.
Touted as a cleaner alternative to regular gasoline, both sides of the aisle have celebrated the lifting of a ban on E15 this summer. But a study published earlier this year from the University of Wisconsin suggests otherwise, claiming land use change in corn production has an adverse effect on the environment.
What this study did was look at some USDA statistic data from 2008 to 2016, coming to some conclusions that did U.S. core ethanol production result in land use change in Midwest.
Dr. Michael Wong has been studying ethanol greenhouse gas emissions for 25 years at Argonne National Lab in Illinois. Several studies from Argonne during this time have shown ethanol-based fuels do have some greenhouse gas benefit.
From 2005 to 2019, we have much higher ethanol yield, meaning we generate more ethanol from the same amount of corn with less fossil energy inputs. So those two major factors led to having less greenhouse gas emissions per gallon of ethanol.
Because greenhouse gas emissions from land use change can't be directly measured, the assumptions made in this study may have played a big role in its result.
These models are so complex that your choice of parameters is going to play have incredible impact on the answer that you get.
Our results consistently show that ethanol does have greenhouse gas reduction benefit.
The key takeaway from both Dr. Wong's work and the University of Wisconsin study, ethanol production and ethanol use can be more efficient. Scientists at Argonne continue to study engine manufacturing to make ethanol-based fuels even more productive.
There are instances where ethanol can help to reduce emissions and allow for that engine to reach its maximum efficiency or performance to unlock that potential.
Additionally, Dr. Brown and Dr. Wong argue that farming practices that act to reduce carbon emissions should be incentivized.
We need to be paying more attention to something called regenerative agriculture. And the name tells it all. The notion, can we actually start building soils by changes in agriculture? And when we're building soils, what we're doing is we're adding carbon. We're adding carbon actually from the atmosphere. So this is building soil carbon, soil organic matter, and we can change the way we do agriculture to accomplish that.
If we take all these activities, we could drive ethanol carbon intensity to zero.
And thanks for joining us for this WeatherFirst special on Iowa's wild weather.
You can connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
And if you missed any part of this special, you can always catch our work online at iowasnewsnow.com.
You can stay up to date with Iowa's wild weather with the Iowa's News Now weather app. Thanks for joining us.